So we see American foreign policy during from 1945 to the present, and there will be some massive, massive changes throughout this time period, especially compared to prior to World War II. Some of the fundamental questions we have to look at here is the impact of the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and how the end of the Cold War changed things in American foreign policy. So, beginning with the time period directly after World War II and the legacy that it has on American foreign policy, the United States is one of the few countries to come out of the war completely unscathed. The imperialist powers, including France and Great Britain, were severely weakened, as well as the other Axis countries. This led to decolonization. So many of the countries in the Middle East and Asia got freedom. There were two superpowers, and this is the key part of American foreign policy after World War II, was the simmering conflict with the Soviet Union and the United States. Also, after the World War II, we see the creation of Israel as kind of a fix for the Holocaust. The Jews got their homeland. So again, you can see here the decolonization of Africa, the Middle East, and in Asia. So there are a few things to understand about the Cold War. We've got two opposing sides, the East and the West. The Soviet Union represents the East. They represent communism. They have the police state, whereas the United States is in the West, and it's capitalistic and has democracy. It also has Western Europe on its side. So you got these two warring camps. The Cold War was a war of words and actions and very few episodes of hot conflict. In fact, the United States and the Soviet Union never directly fought each other during the Cold War, which was probably a good thing. The United Nations was created after World War II, and the big thing that made this different from the League of Nations was the United States was involved, and they created a Security Council that would promote international security and peacekeeping, which meant that they actually had an army to go in and have peacekeeping. The permanent members of the Security Council are the big five countries to come out of the war: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and in this case, China. At that time, it was Taiwan, but eventually it would be the People's Republic of China. Any one of those five countries can veto a Security Council resolution, which the United States and the Soviet Union did to each other quite often. And now China does it quite often. Japan was occupied for the first time ever in its history by a foreign power. The United States forced the emperor into a ceremonial role. He was forced to go on the radio and tell everyone that he was not a god. They forced democracy on the Japanese and demilitarized them. In fact, the Japanese constitution says that they're not allowed to have offensive war-making capability. Well, what are they supposed to do if they're threatened by the Chinese or the Russians? Well, the United States created an alliance with them wherein Japan did not have a war or a war-making capability, but the United States would protect them, and they have done so for the last 60 or 70 years. The Iron Curtain term comes from Winston Churchill when the United States and the Western democracies allowed the Soviet Union to have heavy influence on Eastern Europe. And if you look at this map, you can see the red are the countries that are influenced by the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill said that an iron curtain has spread across Europe and it's impenetrable, which means that the Western democracies don't have much influence on those Eastern European countries. Germany was divided into 4 zones: the British, the French, the American, and the Russian zones. Towards the end of the occupation, it turns into West Germany, which included the British, the French, and the American zones, and East Germany, which was part of the Soviet Union zone. Interestingly, in Eastern Germany, the city of Berlin was split in 2. West Berlin being the pocket of democracy, completely surrounded by the communists, and East Berlin, part of the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. So this would be a major point of contention between these 2 warring camps throughout the Cold War. Truman, who took over the presidency after FDR succumbed to exhaustion of fighting the war and fighting the Great Depression, took over office in 1945 and immediately came up with 2 extremely important foreign policy initiatives. The first one is containment, and this one is extremely important. The whole idea being that the United States and the Western democracy, instead of fighting to liberate all the countries that are going to communist, they would severely limit the expansion of communism. So they sought to contain it where it already was. And one of the big ways to do that was the Truman Doctrine, which provided economic and military support for nations threatened by communism. 2 great examples of this were Greece and Turkey. Those 2 countries did not fall to communism because of the Truman Doctrine. The Cold War saw a huge increase in military spending. After it's the highest increase since World War II, really when the Cold War was at its highest point. Compared to the world, the United States spends more than just about everybody else put together. And they're looking to add more to it. You can see here they spend $711 billion. Another major component of the containment plan was Secretary of State George Marshall's Marshall Plan. The idea being to make sure that Western Europe did not fall to communism by instituting a European recovery program. They gave $13 billion in grants to help rebuild Europe. And again, this was to prevent communist uprisings and infiltration in these vulnerable countries that are just getting over World War II. Not long after the war ended, the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, decided to blockade West Berlin. Again, I mentioned earlier that West Berlin was this little pocket of democracy surrounded by the communists. Joseph Stalin prevented any trucks or trains from going from Western Germany into West Berlin. The idea being was that he was going to starve out all the allies that were in West Berlin and turn West Berlin into a communist part of Berlin. In response, Truman initiates the Berlin Airlift, one of the greatest humanitarian efforts in history. So they launched this aerial campaign where they dropped food and fuel to everybody in West Berlin. Over 200,000 flights. They dropped 47,000 tons of supplies to West Berlin daily from 1945, from 1948 to 1949 until Stalin decided that it was not going to work. Truman also initiates the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, a permanent alliance between the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, where if one member is attacked, everyone will defend them. This alliance has gotten bigger and bigger over the years. The Soviet response to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was the Warsaw Pact, where the Eastern European satellite countries entered into a formal alliance with the Soviet Union. Although an alliance is a tricky word there because it was really the Soviet Union dominating all those Eastern European countries. Truman also had to deal with the first little hot part of the Cold War, which was the Korean conflict. North Korea, a communist country, invaded South Korea. The Truman and the United Nations determined to intervene. After some back and forth, to the point where the United States and the United Nations had almost completely taken over North Korea, had to be repelled by Chinese troops 1 million Chinese troops that, quote, volunteered for the North Korean army. They pushed things back to the status quo. They signed an armistice in 1953, and neither one of them really got anything out of the deal. So Truman, he gets the idea, I mean, he gets a win-loss out of this. The win is that containment worked, but he also looked weak because he couldn't stop these communists and wipe them off the face of the earth. So the Korean conflict was a kind of a bitter pill for Harry Truman. We also start to see the development of the nuclear arms race. The United States, of course, is the only country to ever use nuclear arms in war, something that the Soviet Union pointed out quite frequently during the Cold War. They begin to develop weapons that are stronger, faster, less likely to be detected. The Soviet Union, using probably the greatest spy agency in history, stole all the nuclear secrets from the United States and built their own nuclear weapon. The United Kingdom and France followed soon after, and then China followed. So these are the major countries that have nuclear weapons. Eventually, Pakistan and India would join the nuclear club, and now we can start to see why all these nuclear countries do not want to have others added to the group. With more countries that have them, the more likely they are to be used. So there's really a lot of fear among all the countries that have nuclear weapons for North Korea and Iran to have their own weapons. After World War II, we have the Second Red Scare. And it's after the World War II that becoming a communist or a socialist is absolutely unacceptable. You'll see some stuff when we talk about domestic policy, more about Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism, where he was doing this witch hunt looking for communists in government. He even accused George Marshall, the guy who came up with the Marshall Plan, of being a communist, until eventually he is taken out of the power that he had managed to gain by using fear. Eisenhower takes over, wins the election in 1952, and comes up with a really kind of frightening foreign policy known as brinkmanship. The idea that you take the world to the brink of nuclear war and then stop. So it's pretty scary. His Secretary of State comes up with something called massive retaliation, wherein if somebody attacks the United States with a nuclear weapon, the United States will use everything in their power to destroy that country. The domino theory is also developed during this time. A pretty good example of this is the idea that if China and Korea become communist, then Vietnam will. So the idea was, hey, we got to stop Vietnam from becoming communist, because if Vietnam does, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, until everybody is communist, and the only one left is the United States. So they want to stop the dominoes from starting at all. One of the ways they did this was to execute the Eisenhower Doctrine, where they extended the Truman Doctrine of military and financial help to Middle Eastern countries. He also conducted covert operations using CIA and special forces in places like Iran and Guatemala to prevent communist sympathizers from taking over. Things start to thaw out a little bit with the Soviet Union in 1953. People are starting to get a little scared of what could happen. But the Hungarian revolt in 1956 and the massive casualties that are incurred when the Soviet Union puts that revolt down makes people start to rethink being nice to the Soviets. And then when the Soviets put the first man-made satellite into space, Sputnik, everybody in America freaks out, thinking that they're going to put missiles on this satellite to shoot at us, and it really begins the space race. The Vietnam War doesn't officially really begin until 1965 or 1964, but if you look at what's going on in Southeast Asia during Eisenhower's presidency, you can start to see the beginnings of it. After World War II, France tries to take Vietnam back. Ho Chi Minh leads the communists against France, and they kick France out in 1954. The United States decides to help South Vietnam to prevent them from turning communist. And then things escalate from there. In Cuba, Fidel Castro deposes the democratically elected dictator, Batista. Cuba forms an alliance with the Soviet Union, and America is scared to death that a communist country is 90 miles away from the United States. So they begin thinking of ways to kill Fidel Castro or overthrow him. When Eisenhower left office, he gave a speech talking about the military-industrial complex and how it could cause some serious problems in America because of all the money being funneled into the military and into the defense contractors. And for the most part, he's pretty much been right all about this.